um, and one can even say, I guess some Muslim folks look at Jesus as a prophet who was critiquing the Roman Empire, and his words eventually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire. Um, and I think I have always been interested in social justice and social critique because of my family's history with the Holocaust and the destruction of all those people I was never able to meet. Uh,
Right, right, right.
what, what it so Karl Marx was critiquing, his big book came out in 1948, right? And is that Das Kapital or is it Communist Revolution, the Communist Manifesto?
The Communist Manifesto, yeah.
Okay. And he's saying that workers should have the ownership over their factory, and that these kings and queens and also factory owners are screwing over the common person, and that history is about class struggle. And if the workers of the world actually united, they could overthrow these one percenters. And then the revolutions of 1848 unfortunately failed in some ways. And so a lot of German Jews then come to America. So since 1848 until now, tell us a little bit where are the pockets that socialism did work and it was actually a good experiment, and then where are some of the pockets where it I don't know, didn't go so well?
Well, that's a very, yeah, it's a very deep question to answer. Um, I think that socialism, I would probably just say that socialism on a world scale has not been implemented. So that the call that Marx and Engels ended the Communist Manifesto with, where they said the workers of all countries have to unite because you have nothing to lose but your chains. So that kind of has this implication that capitalism is, as we might call it now, a global system or a modern a world system. And so for having socialism in one country will not change the whole international relations of capitalist production. So I think the greatest challenge is how to organize a world system that is not based on private ownership of the means of production, but is based on collective ownership, democratic ownership. And that, I think, in that sense, it has not happened yet. But we have had a lot of experiments with socialism. Um, on the one hand, there are states that call themselves socialist or communist, primarily throughout the 20th century, such as Russia or China, various states in Latin America and the Middle East and North Africa. And then you also have the traditions of social democracies and democratic socialism that primarily you'll see in countries throughout Europe, and which have more of a strong, robust welfare state and shrinking of the gap between the rich and the poor, and a more equitable treatment of workers with stronger unions and things like that. So I think kind of you can look at all those different traditions in the Marxist kind of socialist framework. But the big thing I'm trying to study, so at UCR, my focus is in political economy and global change. And that's just specifically because I'm very interested in thinking about internationally, how can we get to this ideal of changing social relations on a global scale so that society is based on the ownership of by ordinary working people, rather than private ownership that's monopolized by 8 or 10 different billionaires.
Right, right, right. So you've seen a lot of success with Bernie Sanders, in some ways maybe more capitalistic, but Elizabeth Warren, of this discussion of the 1% and the 99%. And I would say kind of like a lot of folks, a lot of maybe working class folks that jumped on the Trump train were kind of frustrated but misguided. Maybe they shouldn't have jumped on that train. They should have jumped on the Bernie train. I agree with your vision, and it's going to be tough but it
Right.
will lead to a more liberatory kind of loving society. So how do you get more of the 99% folks to, I don't know, love and respect themselves enough to not want to be part of these, you know, handful of global elites that are, you know, just getting a lot of the money and not giving it to folks that are working for them? How do we make that shift?
Yeah, that's another great question. So when Occupy Wall Street started in 2011, I was living in Athens, Georgia, and I was participating in the local Athens chapter of Occupy. And I did like the movement because it kind of was like a precursor to the Bernie movement and the kind of interest in, you know, class struggle and class warfare. It also kind of was a precursor to what you would now call populism, because we had the Tea Party, who was more of a right-wing sector, and you had, you know, Occupy. But one of the things I've always thought was a sort of the way that Occupy frames it was in the sense that you have the 99% versus the top 1%. And that's a kind of framing that's based on the distribution of incomes, so that it's arguing that from, you know, if you look back in the mid 20th century, during the New Deal era, you had a stronger welfare state. So the gap between the top and the bottom was smaller. Whereas since the era of Reagan and Clinton and what we call neoliberal capitalism, you see this gap between the rich and the poor rising. So that's why I think you see after the, you know, Great Recession and the financial collapse of Wall Street and the housing market, everyone's life kind of was thrown into chaos, including myself, because I had just, you know, was recently graduating college, and that was so I think a lot of people were very attuned to the distribution between 99% and the top 1%. But I think maybe one way that I think was the sort of limitation of that is that it only kind of focuses on how income is distributed and who gets what resources and who gets what access to wealth and income. And that question doesn't really get at a deeper question, which is who produces the wealth,
Mm,
right? Which is there's distribution and then there's production.
mm,
And so it's a very strong critique of capitalists' inability to distribute wealth equally. But we have to actually, in my view, go to that next step, which is asking, why is capitalism set up in a way where only private owners monopolize the means of producing wealth? And the vast majority of humanity doesn't own the means of wealth, so they have to sell their own labor to make a living. And
mm.
so I think that question is where we could go even a bit further in that direction. But yeah, I'm sorry if I got if I got off point, but that's kind of my main thought. I think the other thing you were talking about is a bit about the Trump supporters, and I guess the main thing I'll say about that is just that if we have a strong left that is vibrant, that is well organized, and that is convincing people that the left has the answers to things, then I feel like that the right will be less strong at convincing people to follow into their path. And I think that obviously there are some people who are going to be bigots, and they're going to be prejudiced and racist and anti-Semitic and sexist and homophobic, regardless of what the left does. But at least if we have a strong left that gives people an alternative, then they won't see Trump as their solution. We can at least start to migrate some of those people towards a new perspective, at least in my hope.
No, I agree. Because, okay, I want to come back to several things because you look at QAnon, you look at these conspiracy theories, and it's folks wanting to believe in something and wanting to find solutions to kind of maybe the effed up life that they're going through. And so it's a weird, misguided thing. And I've been watching documentaries about a lot of these political movements that are happening. But I feel like in the corporate media, we kind of like stop at where we're talking now. And we're just like, yeah, like socialism is a good idea, or democratic socialism is a good idea, but well, it's probably going to be too hard. So let's push past that, because the corporate media doesn't really flesh out a bunch of ideas. So, and if we can't envision what that future could look like, it's very difficult to get there. So right now you have these kind of like these harsh pyramids. where it's like, okay, all you people are going to work for Walmart, and then like the Walton family that owns Walmart is going to get all the money, and they're going to like, you know, if they have to, they'll give healthcare to some of their workers, but they don't. There's internal problems of the distribution of wealth even within this company. So for the layman or laywoman who's listening, what could it look like differently outside of this hyper corporate model?
That's also a great question. Man, you have so many difficult questions though, but I love it. I can think of three models, and again, I'm not saying this is like perfect, but one model would just be that you keep the same ownership structure of like a company like Walmart, but that you regulate it much stronger, and you might have like laws in place that prevent monopolies. You might have stronger labor unions, stronger workers protections in the law, more welfare, you know, all kinds of things like that that limit the power of the company. But in that model, that might be more of like a social democracy, social democrat type model, because it doesn't actually challenge the ownership structure of the company. So then if you go to question of who owns Walmart, then there's one model which is kind of like market socialism, which could be that, let's just say the workers take over Walmart. And so Walmart will essentially stay the same, but instead of the Walton family being the owners of it, basically every employee and everyone who works at Walmart will all own it, and they'll collectively and democratically decide how we produce things and what the company does and things like that. But that company of Walmart will still be embedded in like market forces in terms of a distribution of a global market economy. And then the final model would be that you would bring the market itself under some form of central planning. And that would, of course, the critique of central planning has always been that it can lead to authoritarianism and, you know, like the Soviet Union or something like that with bureaucracy. But there's some interesting work that's been done in recent years, specifically on Walmart. And I can't remember the name of the sociologist right now, but they basically studied Walmart, and we're kind of arguing that Walmart as a private corporation already engages in central planning, as does Amazon and Google and all these other giant companies, as do the giant Wall Street firms. They already engage in planning, and they already use all of the information they get from us consumers via our clicks and our things we buy online to kind of plan what resources they need to produce and what distributions they need to offer. So the argument that this new model would be that you could have central planning, but it would be democratic, and that it would be a kind of, you know, national democratic or global democratic planning that determines who gets what in the distribution. So I guess that's three ways. You could keep the capitalist structure, you could, and regulate it. Then you could also bring it under workers' control, but keep the market. And then finally, you could bring it under workers' control and centralize centralize the ownership and centralize planning. So that's a mouthful. Yeah.
No. I mean, so it sounds like you can have the Biden plan, which is like regulation or reform. And in the left movement, there's a lot of reform is a bad word right now, because the system keeps going, right? So the first thing, correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of the Biden way. The middle way is the Bernie way, or the AOC Bernie way, which is more the workers' own parts of it. Which, right, okay. And then the third way we don't really have right now, because in American politics, which is part of what your work is, you're challenging American political system and saying the squad is good, but they're on the fringes of neoliberalism. They're still in the reform camp. We actually need a working party, a working family, democratic socialist party that is advocating for the third way that we don't really have in our politics right now. Okay, before I get there, Amazon, Google, and some of these other places, hey, if you come work for me, I'll give you a share. Is that a way of working around this stuff?
That's also a good question, because I think that came up a few weeks ago, or whenever it was with the GameStop company and the Reddit forum on Wall Street traders who kind of, it was kind of like a take of small traders versus the big Wall Street
Mm,
firms. And I think that that was a good, way of kind of building class consciousness and like getting people to see that the system, the game of Wall Street is rigged. But it seems like that on itself, in and of itself alone, I don't know if that would be able to actually change the structure of Wall Street. Because as soon as the independent sellers started making a lot of profit from the GameStop trading, the Federal Reserve basically stepped in and shut the whole thing down and kind of like the Robinhood trading app that they were using, like cut it down and said no more trading shares on GameStop. So there's kind of always these mechanisms that the state has that it can ensure that kind of the capitalist class will continue to make their profits, even if people start like, hey, I'm going to start buying up my shares of these companies. Another way of doing it that might be a little bit more effective would be, instead of just having individual people buy up shares, you could have the state buy up shares and be like, hey, we're going to just own all the shares of your company now. And so now the government will, use that corporation as kind of like its own public service or something, through the means of controlling its shareholders. But
mm,
but I think that would take a lot more than just these individual masses of people who are all kind of collectively rising up,
mm.
which again I think it's a good thing, but it needs more focus to actually lead towards a solution, I think.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I agree with you, because the GameStop thing, the little guy won for like a couple weeks, but like you said, the kind of the uber capitalist class has a way to knock that stuff out. I want to get back to your biography, but also like
Yeah.
what what K through 16 educators can do in teaching finance and stuff like that in schools. But before we get there, like, um, yeah, okay, like China, right? China is an interesting example of, went through this really like bloody communist turned totalitarian government turned like kind of capitalist, but central planning. What is your take on China's weird conglomeration of capitalist stuff, but then central planning, where their infrastructure is really good, right? They, if they want to build like bullet trains, they could do that. If they want to seize, whatever, poor people's lands and build a dam, they can do that because it's just a one-party system. What is your take on China's system?
Oh, that's a very hard question to answer. I'll have to just preface it. I'm not an expert on China by any means, but um, one of the things just a brief comment is that the history of China is as you know, as a historian and as an educator, right, is that China and Russia, these states that had successful communist revolutions in the 20th century, they were not necessarily at that point in time, they were not capitalist states, the same way that like Germany or Britain were in the 19th and 20th centuries, capitalist advanced industrial societies with a working class and stuff. So China was primarily an agrarian society that was pre-industrial in many aspects. And so they did not quite even have this mass proletariat or mass working class. They had peasantry and farmers and things like that. So in a way, the ideology of communism was kind of a means by which Chinese society advances its means of production above, from the kind of agrarian feudalism to a modern industrial economy that's able to compete on a world scale with the advanced capitalist societies in the West. And of course, as you pointed out, there's a lot of problems when it comes to single party state, lack of democracy, and things of that nature. So in terms of the other aspects of China, I'd have to probably do more research into it, the
Yeah, no.
deep specifics, but that's kind of my general thoughts on it for now.
Yeah, and then the human rights really sucks, because Uyghurs and the concentration camps and Tibet and all these types of things. But what do you, okay, to wrap this up in a,
Yeah.
in a little bit, but do you see hope America can make this shift towards, you know, I think Biden would, on his best days, like to think of himself as a FDR, that he's getting people the vaccines, that he's going to build infrastructure, that he's going to do, immigration reform, and I don't want to be a cynic and say none of that's going to happen, because some of it is happening, and I'm hoping Biden and Harris and the whole cadre of Democrats make things happen, and it looks positive right now. But like we say, going back to normal is really, really dangerous, right? Normal was terrible for a lot of people. How do you see America maybe taking that turn past the FDR model and going into the place that you would hope it would go to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that we're I look at it using the term like crisis, like social crisis or legitimation crisis, basically, that we've had over the last 20 years since I've been a teenager to my 20s and 30s, just a series of, endless wars, massive economic devastation on a global scale, the right police brutality, and now the COVID pandemic. So at this point, it seems that when we go back to what is called normal, it's the normalcy of the system is continually kind of producing these crises. And the crises are generating all sorts of political instability, this kind of polarization between the liberals and the conservatives. And with that, you see all this extremism on the far right that's emerging, that are, angry about the globalists or immigrants and all of these things. And I think that, yeah, so I think that if the goal is to go back to the way things were, I don't think that would work. I do think you need a much stronger program yes, it would have to be more like the New Deal. I don't think that Biden has proposed anything of that level to this point. But again, even if we go back to the New Deal, there is a question. We have to remember that the New Deal didn't actually resolve, like for example, they tried in the 60s the war on poverty, and that got derailed by the war in Vietnam and the fact that the US is this kind of global empire. And so I think that if we are going to try to revitalize like social democracy, we need to challenge we need to go further than Biden's offering, and we need to challenge the status of US imperialism. But even still, yeah. So I think that that's quite a heavy challenge. But I think now is the time, because if we don't do this, if we don't push towards the left, I think these forces of these extremist groups on the right will continue festering and growing and getting stronger. Even if Trump is no longer in office, there's still that discontent and that anger that's there. And I don't think that the kind of centrist policy is going to quash that anger unless we push further to the left, I think.
Right. And the class struggle, BIPOC communities would push against that and be like, it's class, but it's also race. And so how does race factor into your studies as well?
I think in quite a few ways. I mean, I think that race itself is kind of a social relation that emerges from class society, or in particular capitalism, because we have to remember that when capitalism was first created, or when it first emerged, how did capitalists get their private property? Well, they did it by going around from Europe to the entire rest of the world and enslaving half of the population, and colonizing and killing off the rest of it. So this process of slavery and colonization that created this division between white Europeans and the global South, people of color, I think that the legacies of that is something that is deeply connected to I don't know, the process of capitalist accumulation. And so I think that the majority of the global working class are people of color. And I think that the class struggle is the struggle to eliminate racism and to eliminate racial inequality. So I think that those things, in my view, are, deeply intertwined.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I think a lot of folks missed that, and I got cast on my bookshelf over here because, and this goes into the PhD that I did. Uh, the racial hierarchy that we see in a lot of countries in the world, unfortunately, is also overlaid by a class hierarchy. Because, as you say, um, in the old days, and the old days become the new days, your how much melanin you had in your skin meant where you fit into the caste, right? And as we know, if you had more melanin, you had to be the essential workers of that time, right? And you were not paid. You were an enslaved person, and so the social economic status matched your racial skin tone, and we're still working through that as a country and as a world. We're not working through that.
Right.
Right. Or yeah, like people are just like closing their ears, closing their eyes, don't want to hear that. We like to ask, or I like to ask folks on the show, like in your K through 16 experience, or even just your, household, family, education, were there certain people in your upbringing that got you into these issues of social inequities, socialism, Marxism, etc.?
Well, I didn't specifically come from a socialist family, so I wasn't like a red diaper baby or something like that with like, my parents reading me baby stories about like Trotsky or something. But but no, actually I was very different in high school. I was actually like in terms of my approach to education, I was always someone who was very like I love my whole life as long as I can remember. I loved books, as you can see. I'm like a huge book obsessive nerd, and so I was like always a very independent minded learner that I wanted to read and study things. But I never liked high school. I never liked school, like the system of school itself. And growing up in a very small, like, kind of conservative town in the South, it's like all of the not all the teachers I had in high school, I felt were very conservative, almost like a lot of them, racist or reactionary, and so my thought of like teaching was just that kind of model where they just beat you over the head and you have to learn this and don't question me. So I really didn't like formal education because of that until I went to community college when I was after high school and started seeing that you can actually have critical knowledge and critical learning. And so I think my early experience, I really wish that I would have had more teachers in high school who were open-minded and who were critical thinkers and who were like radical or revolutionary or progressive and who encouraged and instilled that kind of thinking in me, instead of just saying this is what you have to do so you can learn this and then get a job and then work and then and that's like all so I really do think that would have been a great thing to have. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of connected to community college myself, because that was when I first started out as a student. And also I like talking to students who are from different backgrounds that aren't necessarily like formally educational, who don't have a lot of formal educational experience per se.
Hmm. Hmm.
I
Tell us.
should also mention my grandfather on my mother's side is uh, a college professor, and he is emeritus at University of Texas, Austin, teaching in philosophy and education. But the thing about my grandfather is we kind of had an estranged relationship with my grandfather growing up. So it wasn't until I was like probably in my early 20s when I got really a chance to reconnect with him. And then it was amazing because I realized this man who I didn't really connect with a lot when I was a child, but as I got older, I realized we had so many things in common. We're basically like the same person. And so I realized like my own interest in sociology and in philosophy and in politics, like it was very similar to my grandfather. So it's just an interesting thing that there's like sometimes this legacy can pass down from a few different generations and stuff.
Hmm. So where was the aha moment? Was it in a classroom? Was it talking to your grandfather? And we've had some conversations where he's like, oh, like my grandfather gave me this book. And so there
Yeah.
seems to be this kind of interesting affinity there. I want to be a professor like him. But was there an aha moment of like, this is what I want to do, and or workers are getting screwed over?
Yeah, I mean, well, that was probably a little bit before I got reconnected with my grandfather, but maybe it just goes back to like when I was growing up in Georgia. Um, we had this kind of typical like middle class family in a small town in a suburban neighborhood where my dad would go to work every day, this 9 to 5 in this office, kind of like in a cubicle, like Office Space, like in that movie. And so that kind of in a way also kind of radicalized me just thinking about it, because it's like my dad is always a guy who he was very creative. He's an artist, he plays guitar, he's a musician, he wants to do all that stuff with his life, but he put that on hold because he has to go to work, he has to get a job, he has to be a breadwinner, he has a family and kids to support, right? And so I always thought about that. I'm like, why does society not give us the tools to be able to have a job, to have a family, to support your family, but also to do the things you want, to be creative, to be artistic, to follow your passions and your dreams instead of having to push those aside? So I always, I guess, like when I was young, even in high school, I was in a band, and the name of our band was called Corporate Slaves, because this we were kind of making fun of the Bush era crony capitalist society. And so I think I was influenced by that, just growing up.
Hmm. And you also like Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so well, music was a big part of my upbringing, because like when I felt like my school system in high school was too stifling and too conservative, I always thought, oh, I can listen to Rage Against the Machine or something like that, and that can teach me about politics and ideas.
I agree with you. I mean, I was listening to Tupac at a young age, and he was talking about all these terrible things that are happening on the streets, and whatever government's complicity or police brutality, or pumping in crack cocaine into certain neighborhoods, uh, and it gave me a kind of social justice lens. Did Rage Against the Machine and other bands do that for you?
Yeah, definitely. It was a combination of that, and just being in the South and being like it's heightened in the sense that if you're in California, like the baseline is more of a liberal Democrat kind of viewpoint, whereas where I grew up, the baseline was a conservative Republican, Christian kind of viewpoint. And so yeah, music kind of was an influence to me. Also, just Jewish culture and like radical Jewish history and stuff like that was a big influence on me. And yeah, and all those things.
What was it like to be Jewish in the South?
That's a good question. I think that it's a bit smaller. It's a bit more more reform, I guess, because you don't have it's more assimilated, I guess you could is one way I would put it. And my family, even though my grandfather was a professor, but going back further than that, they came to the South in the early 20th century because they did the whole immigration from Europe thing, and then they went from
Hungarian,
what's that?
Hungarian or Romanian Jews?
Yeah, Austria-Hungarian area, and they were in the schmata business, meaning they did clothing and stuff like that, and I believe they went down from New York down south, and because they realized at the time that there's all these small towns in the South, and they need clothing stores, and they need people to little merchant class people to do that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of family history going back over hundreds or so years, is working in these kind of schmata business, the merchant business in the South. And
Hmm.
so you had these weird situations like a small town in Mississippi where my mom grew up had maybe 1,000, 2,000 people in the whole population, but there was like a reform temple, and they had, a Jewish small business that sold clothes and stuff. And so that was kind of my understanding that a lot of Southern Jews were kind of from that background.
Hmm.
And to this day, it's I think it's a lot harder to be Jewish in the South. Even if you just yes, there's like the anti-Semitism and there's the Christian fundamentalism, but also if there's less other Jewish people around in Rest community and less Jewish culture, then it's a bit more difficult, I think. And I think that might be true of any kind of minority group in the South.
What about Black and Jewish relations, solidarity? We just saw Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff become the first Jewish and Black senators from Georgia. Is there that, did you grow up with this notion of, oh, we were oppressed as Austro-Hungarian Jews in Europe, and we have a duty to help out Black folks? Because I know I grew up with that, with my father being born in a refugee camp in Germany and his parents being in Auschwitz. This notion of the Hitler wanted to kill Black people too, right? He wanted to kill everybody he didn't agree with and racialized as other, including Jews and Romani and other people, LGBT folks and folks with disabilities. Did you have that kind of, I don't know if we call it radical Judaism or just social justice lens Judaism with Black and Jewish notions?
I think so. I think I don't think it's probably not to the extent that you did, but I think that yes, the Holocaust was an important lesson, a moral lesson. The idea of slavery and Jim Crow being these things that we oppose, that's also was an important thing. I think there was sympathy for those struggles. I think that one of the unfortunate things, though, and I don't want to generalize, but I think that historically Southern Jewry was a bit more conservative on those questions. Like if you look in the civil rights movement, there was a lot of Jews involved, but a lot of them came from the North, right? That were the Freedom Riders or what have you, and they came down South. But the local Southern Jews, yes, they supported, they were sympathetic, but there were some of them that were kind of iffy on it. And there was also some that had this perspective that like, if the Jews got too involved in the civil rights era, it will make us look bad, like we'll be the targets of the KKK. And so we don't want that. Like, and that was, examples like in the Atlanta in the 50s, there was a bombing of a major temple in Atlanta that, it's to this day, there's still like a museum that dedicated to it and all that, but
Benevolent Congregation, right? 1958.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there was, it's interesting, but yeah, there was a bit more of this more assimilationist, like we don't want to rock the boat too much because we don't want to put a target on our backs kind of thing. But of course, I think that's changing. The South today and is a very different place than it was, in that time. And I think Jews today are one of the groups in America from like looking at the like Pew demographic opinion surveys, one of the most sympathetic groups to racial justice and progressive causes seems to be American Jews. So,
wow, yeah, I mean it's a disturbing history because Yehuda Benjamin was on the Confederate money, and Yehuda Benjamin was a slave owner, and then when the Civil War came to an end, he escaped to England and became the Queen's counsel. He was a lawyer for the Queen and escaped any judgment. And us as Jews, we talk a lot about judgment at Nuremberg and judgment of those who did atrocities in Europe. And so it's a little bit uncomfortable for us to think that there were Jews that benefited from that some Jews enslaved Black people in the South.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there was people like Leo Frank, right? What is 1913, 1915, who got lynched in Marietta, Georgia,
right.
because the KKK was out to get him. So it's a complicated history down there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that you're correct that obviously that Jews participated in segregation, Jim Crow, Jews participated in slave trade. And that's true. I mean, the one kind of negative thing too is that sometimes people on both sides, right, like they'll exaggerate the Jewish history of racial justice to make Jews seem like we've always only universally supported the Black struggle, which isn't really correct. But there's the other extreme where on the more conservative, side, they'll say like, oh, well, the Jews were the ones pulling the strings of the slave trade. And it's like, no, that, so I think that the truth of that is that it was somewhere in the middle, that Jews were, Jews that went from Europe to the United States were obviously, they had that history of discrimination and oppression, and even in the United States faced discrimination and oppression too. But they, as long as they were on the side of the so-called color line, where they were on the white side, then, and they had the means to enjoy those benefits in society, like not being on the wrong side of Jim Crow or owning slaves and things like that.
Right.
But yeah, it's complicated, and I think that for us today, the important thing is to learn from that history and to try to be on the right side of the history when it comes to the future, and stand, you know, as Jews, as people on the side of justice on all these issues. No, that's, I think that so what you're saying, if I understand, is that there are different social divisions, and there's like gradations between, there's not just like one and the other, right? And Jews have always been historically like very sort of difficult to define in terms of where we fit in that social hierarchy. Just one example is, one of the early sociologists was a guy named George Simmel, and he was of a Jewish background in Germany at the 19th century, and he wrote that the Jews were the, he called them the outsiders or the strangers, which is a person who's not on one side or the other, but you're kind of caught in between both worlds. And he related that to the kind of economic role that Jews had in Europe of kind of merchants and moneylenders and things like that. So there's been a long history of trying to figure out, you know, where do Jews pass? And today on the left, the main debates I hear about is, do Jews have white privilege? Are Jews white? Or are Jews like white passing, or a white population who can also experience anti-Semitism from KKK members? So there's a lot of divisions in there. And at the end of the day, though, it's a very difficult question. But you're right. And the thing about Cleveland, I haven't heard of that specifically, but I know in the South there has been a lot of anti-Semitism. Zach brought up the synagogue bombing in Atlanta. There was the case of Leo Frank being lynched. There was also just this kind of general Christian kind of supremacy attitude. And there's a tendency in the South too of like, or there's not a tendency, a history in the South of kind of like Jews not being able to join the same country clubs or the same social organizations that you know, regular white Gentiles could join. So I think all of those things, for me, it complicates it when people try to portray Jews as just being only on the side of power and privilege, and ignore the fact that Jews are in this kind of complicated, you know, mixed dynamic of oppression. I don't know, Zach, if you had any other thoughts on that stuff, because this seems like it also seems to be pretty much in your wheelhouse too.
I think you hit it on the head. Jews have been a wedge community between Anglo whiteness and collective blackness, as Bonilla Silva would talk about. And at certain times in history, Jews have been, Ashkenazi Jews, I should say, because Ethiopian Jews, right, cannot blend into white society, or Latinx Jews or Native Jews, but or Black Jews. But Jared Kushner, Stephen Mnuchin, Stephen Miller, some of these Jewish folks, unfortunately, have utilized their white privilege to join the Trump administration and, in my opinion, create legislation that was very, very harmful to Jewish people, as well as folks of color, and as well as Anglo whites. And so I think there have been, as immigration has, you know, happened in America, South Asian folks have become wedge communities between collective whiteness and collective blackness, and Asian American communities have become wedge groups. And as the new wedge groups come in, meaning wedge in the middle of the pyramid, Jews have somewhat been pushed up into wealth accumulation, but also white ascendancy. But it is always a bit conditional, because as we saw in 2017, the Jews will not replace us, and the great replacement and all these types of things of again, white fear and white grievances that that white Jews are going to take over their lives. And the Jews are working with Black and brown communities to de-whiteify and de-Christianize America. It was the same crap that was said about us in Europe, you know, different continent, same stuff. And it's frustrating to see that. But I guess my philosophy is always working with communities of color to make sure that they are not killed and that we are not killed, because we know that our survival is at the end of the day much more wrapped up in communities of color and oppressed people of the world, because we've seen all too often in history the other side of that coin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have time for me to make another comment on this
Yeah,
topic?
please,
Or
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
oh, thanks. So I just want to be mindful of the time, but as you were talking, and Joel's question got me thinking that there also is a long kind of Marxist and socialist tradition of studying anti-Semitism from a socialist perspective, and so it goes back to one of the earliest works Karl Marx wrote. It was he wrote an essay called "On the Jewish Question," and it's very famous and controversial. But the kind of main idea is he distinguishes between what he calls the material Jew and the idealist Jew. And so like the idealist Jew is like the values and beliefs that we have as Jews. Like, for example, we might believe that, you know, we should never oppress anybody because of the Holocaust. That's like an idea or a belief. But he says that to really understand what Jews or any other ethnic group is doing, you have to look at their material foundation, like how they actually live their everyday lives in order to produce themselves and reproduce their existence. So this leads to this kind of Marxist term called, or socialist term called, it's a term called the socialism of fools.
Mm.
And this, what this kind of means is that, let's say you have a Jewish merchant who owns a small business in a Black neighborhood, right? And the people that are in the poor working class people in the Black neighborhood might see that these small business owners who are Jewish are kind of screwing them over and taking their wealth and taking their money and their resources, right? So they might believe in the Jews are the ones to blame for why the Black community there is being exploited. So in the kind of Marxist framework, they call that the socialism of fools, and it's meant to imply that it's a form of scapegoating. And you can kind of see this today, where some of the rhetoric Trump uses and the far right uses, where they talk about the globalists and you know, things like that. Like on the one hand, you can say, yeah, there is global capitalism. There's the IMF and the World Bank, and you know, things like that. But on the other hand, it's not the Jews who are the globalists, who are the ones pulling the strings. So in a way, it's kind of a misdirection. Instead of actually looking at the true picture of socialism, you misdirect people's anger by scapegoating them onto the Jews and blaming the Jews for it.
Mm.
So that's one way of looking at it.
And Trump being a globalist himself, wanting to build the towers in Moscow. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know we have to wrap up, but I think it's important to think about European Jewry as there were like very poor Jews in Poland and Russia, where there was more assimilationist, wealthier Jews in Germany. And it's interesting that Karl Marx was a German Jew who was writing from England, right? Basically in exile,
Yeah.
and had like a nice kind of comfortable life. But I think philosophers oftentimes can have time to think about and critique society because they've almost taken themselves out of the hustle and bustle of working life. And it's a shame that Karl Marx is demonized so much, because basically all he's trying to tell people is, you guys are getting screwed over and you can have a lot better life if people that own your factory would give you more healthcare and give you a minimum wage. And you know, 1848 was a long time ago, and we're still debating in this country whether we should pay people $15 minimum wage, when in Australia, which is another predominantly white country, predominantly Christian country, $25 is the minimum wage. And so you talk about socialism of fools, and I love that term. I've not heard that. We're almost living in a capitalism of fools, because we don't even know that, you know, just crossing the border to Canada, you get paid a lot more, and you have healthcare, and you have better education, or you have a lot of Americans that can going to Australia or going to the European Union, because you have a more mixed economy where it's capitalism, but they've turned up the volume on some of the socialist aspects of that capitalist country. So anyway, what would you tell K through 16 educators? What's a piece of advice that you wish they would know, that they should bring into the classroom or outside of the classroom that would help their students think about the world in a more progressive, dynamic way?
That's a tough, I don't know. I think that I would just try to think of for myself, what would have helped is if I had the feeling that educators were, if like the whole purpose of education sometimes seems to be not about knowledge for the sake of knowledge or knowledge for the sake of social change for the better. It seems that it's the purpose is instilling knowledge so that you can be the kind of, citizen that can go to work, get a job, settle down, have a family, and then keep producing the system of American capitalist relations, right? So I think that if educators want to be just people who teach how to be a good capitalist and how to be a good worker and how to play by the rules, then to me, then that's not like the kind of education that's going to liberate us. That's the education that is on the side of the capitalist system. And I think we need educators who want to teach people knowledge that's critical knowledge and emancipatory, kind of radical revolutionary knowledge, so that as kids are growing up, they think that they have a future that's beyond just the day-to-day slaving away for the rest of your life until you die, but that they can the knowledge will lead them to collectively try to join with others, join with other working people to improve the world around them. And that's what I try to hope to do with my career as a college teacher.
Hmm. I love that. I love that. That's very beautifully put. When you talk about these ideas with your parents or your family, I know your brother is very progressive. Do
Yeah.
they look at you as like, where did this come from? Or are they like, yeah, rock on. This is what we want for you.
No, I think, well, with my family, they're like, that's cool, but yeah. I mean, sometimes when I'm in sociology class, it's more like they think I'm mashugana. They think I'm crazy a little bit because I don't know. So I don't know. That's a whole different topic though.
You're seen as too radical.
Yeah, I think some sociology tends to be more mainstream, and there's that division between radical and mainstream sociology. So
Mm,
sometimes that comes up, but
mm,
in general for my family, no, pretty much my immediate family, they're pretty like down with
mm,
this kind of stuff, I think.
mm. What role do you think uh, media plays in people's perceptions of democratic socialism, or where society is going? Because I feel like we're in this media moment where
Mhm.
it's like there's like a black renaissance happening right now, where like Hollywood is I don't know, finally recognizing like black brilliance and black excellence, and that like culture drives everything, right? And attention drives everything. And I was reading this article in the New York Times about by Professor Goldhaber, who talks about the attention economy, and that Trump really did a good job of getting eyeballs on him, because if you have eyeballs, then you have power, and then you can make money. Um, in the kind of like cultural zeitgeist we're living in, because we're all at home and we're all just like watching different programs or listening to different stuff because there's not much else to do, unless you unfortunately are an essential worker and have to go out and work, which is the caste system you're talking about. Um, where do you think this cultural media moment is taking us? Is it taking us in a more like liberatory turn towards democratic socialism, or is it taking us to a more just self-indulgent perpetuate capitalism mode?
It's hard to say. One question I am always fascinated about though is the relationship between like media and culture and the economic system, so to speak. So I think that one way we can look at the media is that the media media and culture in Marxian sense is related to ideology. And so you have this division, right, between the material basis of society, people's material interests, what they do, and their everyday existence to produce the objects and things and that we need to survive, right? And
Mm.
then there's the ideological structure that kind of is the media and arts and entertainment that's kind of on top of that. And I think in our society, this is a good example of how the media kind of reflects the kind of class interest of the capitalist, because media is today in this age highly deregulated, so that the ownership of the media is concentrated in the hands of, you know, 3 or 4 multinational corporations. So pretty much all of the airwaves, the telecommunications infrastructure, the streaming platforms, the intellectual property over these films and movies and TV stations, they're none of these things are democratically owned by ordinary working people. They're owned and controlled by private for-profit capitalist interests. So when we try to make social justice and racial justice changes within that system, we're doing so within a media that's a privately owned corporate media. And so I think a challenge is to answer the question, why is the corporate media embracing racial justice at this time? Whereas we know in the past, the media
Mm.
is overtly racist, overtly white supremacist, et cetera. And I think that this is just a way that the media is kind of orienting itself to the realities of contemporary neoliberal society. And they see that whereas 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the way that you could make a profit was through overt racism and overt white supremacy. Whereas today, in part due to the victories of the struggles of civil rights era, it's no longer as profitable for media companies to sell products based on racism and overt homophobia and bigotry and things of that nature. So now the more model is to represent Black voices and Black stories. And again, I think this is all a great thing. We want the media we consume to reflect the actual diversity of the world around us. The only question is kind of whose interest is this serving? Are we having a racially diverse media that's serving the corporate interests? Or are we going to produce a racially just media that works democratically for the people? And I think that's the kind of question we have to look at today.
Mm. Mm. That's well put, man. Yeah, it's always about making a buck, right? So if yesterday it was overt white supremacy would make you a buck, and now today having more racially justice programs, but it's still who's owning these corporations, who's benefiting the most from this material. Yeah, that's a disturbing thought. Well, let's end on a happy note. Uh, yeah,
Is there any happy notes in 2020,
uh,
2021? Is this, I thought we were living in a dystopia right now.
utopia. But you look. Uh, well, it looks like 500 plus thousand people are gonna die in America, uh, and those fall on the same caste, racial caste we were talking about, social economic caste. But after the Spanish flu, 1918, uh, you had the Roaring Twenties, right?
Right.
Which ended in the 1929 stock market bust. So let's not fast forward too much. But I think there will be a I think there will be a new kind of renaissance of people wanting to be together, wanting to collaborate and make interesting, uh, I don't know, everything, books, movies, you name it, art. So I think there's going to be a new rebirth. I just hope it comes back better, right? And
Yeah.
not to steal from Biden, but we do have to build a better society as we come back online. So I don't know. I'm hopeful for the future, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Anything else you want to tell
Yeah.
the folks before we jump off here?
That's a great concluding thought. I'll just say that I hope that, as educators, it's kind of my dream would be that it's our role as educators to help when society comes back, to push it in the direction of change for ordinary working people, and instead of just returning to a status quo that that doesn't benefit anybody but really the people at the top. So hopefully as educators, we have a role to play there.
Amen. Amen to that. And folks who are on the session, you hang out for a little bit afterwards. We could talk a little bit, but I'm just going to end it here for the online audience. So hey, thanks for tuning in to the Community Works Institute Spotlight Series. We're on Fridays, we're on Sundays. We have a Winter Institute, we have a Summer Institute. Joe Brooks is an amazing collaborator, and thanks for running the show here, Joe. Remember, Community Works Institute K through 16 professional development opportunities are abound, and it's a really cool nonprofit because it does ethnography and it brings K through 12 students onto the streets of Los Angeles or Chicago or whatever it is, and then they do ethnography with local artists and local folks that are making food on the street, and you get to like experience the world that you know Jonathan and I are talking about on a with a race, class, and gender lens. So Community Works Institute is a really cool outfit. Check them out, communityworksinstitute.org. And that's it for me, Zach Ritter and John Rich. Thanks for being here, man, and we'll catch you next week.